So, yeah, I've been talking a lot about these guys, the Vikings. We met them on our travels across Norway, mostly in the form of tourism, of course. Also a little bit in Shetland, and even in Aberdeen, the ferry was painted with a big Viking emblem. So they have been marauding their way around the world for quite some time, and this theme that I keep going on about, this pillaging and looting. So I had a great question when I was talking about the Vikings from one of you, which was how do we reconcile this peaceful, tolerant nation of Norway that we started our cruise with these marauders and pillagers? I thought it was a really good question, and I'll try to come on to it. You probably have as many thoughts as I do about that. And we could apply a similar question in a way to the Dutch, where we're heading now. They were, as I mentioned briefly yesterday, the toughest and the meanest of some of the pirates on the open seas. They were slightly preceding the English East India Company in those travels with their marauding of what they called the Nederlands Indië, the Dutch East Indies, which we know today as Indonesia. They were making a fortune out of extracting resources from those islands, mostly what we call the spice trade. So, as I say, how do we reconcile the surprisingly tolerant country of the Netherlands and The Hague, where we're traveling today, but specifically, more specifically, Amsterdam, where we'll be ending, sadly, our cruise tomorrow. Has anybody visited? Anybody know Amsterdam? It's a pretty spectacular place, I think. And it is, confusingly, as I say, one of the centers of these vast empires of expansion and colonialism in the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, which then created this impressive center of art and architecture and learning and tolerance. So, as I say, Amsterdam was one of those great centers, along with perhaps London, Genoa, Venice. But Amsterdam, of all those cities, played a really outsized role in global history. It is probably, I would say, of those cities that I mentioned, architecturally the least, let's say, grandiose, the less pompous of any of them. In terms of its geography, it is probably the least suited to have developed this great role that it went on to play. London, for instance, has a naturally protected river. It has relatively easy navigability out to the sea. It's not far away from where this side, from where we're sailing. And it stands in stark contrast to the topography and the geology and the geography of Amsterdam, which was very definitely not well suited to becoming a great port city. In the Middle Ages, the town was little more than a series of peat bogs, and it really consisted of a series of communities living a pretty much subsistence life on those muddy marshes. And they were essentially modest early Dutch fishing communities, and they lived perched on things called terps, which were basically man-made islands, and they were really very modest and very impoverished. Pliny the Elder, who I always like to quote in his Natural History, he describes them as a poor people occupying high-dwelling mounds or dams. They single-handedly raised to the highest water level they experienced. With their huts they have built on it, they look like sailors when water covers the surrounding land, but they look like shipwrecked when the water has withdrawn, and they hunt around their huts for fish that flee with the sea. From reeds and bulrush they weave rope to tie fishing nets. They collect mire by hand that they let dry through the wind more than through the sun. With this peat they heat their food and their bodies, churned by the northern wind. They only drink rainwater, which they keep in pits at the entrances of their houses. Not a very happy life. Yet the land was settled here nevertheless, mostly because of these peaty soils that Pliny describes. They were clearly good soil for farming, but also, as we saw to some extent in Shetland, peat is clearly a good fuel for heating, and it was essentially the only way they could keep warm. But the only way to combat the danger of flooding from those peaty soils was to collectively fight this common enemy, water. So together, these communities gradually figured out ways to drain those marshy bogs. They built dams and drainage canals, and as they did so, the land level sank. Today, Amsterdam is 2 meters below sea level, which is something you might want to bear in mind when you're walking around tomorrow. But anyway, it remained this ramshackle collection of people camped out on those muddy terps for much of the Middle Ages, this modest, mostly pious coastal community living so close to danger and exposed to the elements and surviving mostly from herring fishing. So some similarities also with some of the countries that we've talked about, some of the similarities with Shetland and the herring fisheries, Iceland as well, Norway too, very subsistence level existence. At this point, though, again, it's worth noting, there is no nation called the Netherlands or Holland. The region forms part of the great Habsburg inheritance of the 16th century. This was a vast area known as the Spanish Netherlands, comprising the Low Countries, Burgundy in what we know today as France, and what today would be Belgium. In the background of all of this, the Protestant Reformation starts to appear. So in fear of these revolting Protestants, Charles V, who's the Holy Roman Empire of the time, orders the city authorities to crack down on such signs of heresy, and particularly any support for Martin Luther. Amsterdam, though, sits right on the edge of this empire. Initially, it ignores the emperor's instructions for one very pragmatic, simple reason, that it had always been dependent for its survival on the fisheries, on seafarers. And they were increasingly incomers from other cultures. And this tradition of welcoming foreigners, of creating a melting pot, if you like, of tolerance and collective consensus becomes central to future Amsterdam's values and to its economic survival, most importantly. So at this point, there is deliberately very little, if any, persecution of these new Protestants who want to come to town. And as a result, Amsterdam stays relatively peaceful in direct contrast to other towns such as Antwerp and Ghent, where the Beeldenstorm develops. And this is an angry and violent clash between Calvinists and Catholics. In Amsterdam, the authorities stay calm. They don't engage in some of the violent rhetoric that's going on around them. And much like we might say the Byzantines that I talked about, when the Vikings approached and tried to attack their city walls, they do something very different. They compromise and they negotiate. The result is, of course, this doesn't please Philip II of Spain, who's Charles V's successor, and he insists on a strategy of suppression. The Amsterdammers hold out. They don't want to go down that route. And by 1578, these Calvinists, who have been uprooting and tearing down Catholic churches in other cities in the area and beyond, of course, further south in Europe, start to hear of this tolerant attitude. And they start to arrive in Amsterdam, and they stage a strangely Dutch bloodless revolution, which was known as The alterati, or the alteration, which is a rather nice word for what became a wholesale but largely peaceful transfer from Catholicism to Protestant Calvinism. The Catholic churches are gradually closed down without much violence, and the oldest Catholic church in Amsterdam was whitewashed and renamed the Ouderkerk, and you can see it when you walk around town tomorrow. This very Catholic city, more or less peacefully, was rebranded as one of the strongholds of Protestant Calvinism. What happened to the surviving Catholics? Well, if you go to the 14th century Begenhof, which is essentially a very pretty courtyard surrounded by almshouses, you'll see the result. It's an example of how the city council has effectively agreed or tolerated Catholic worship, provided it was hidden away in private houses. And the same passive tolerance extended to other groups like the Anabaptists and the Mennonites. They create essentially private churches within these hofias, these very pretty, quiet, private courtyards. Their existence then becomes inextricably linked to these Dutch ideas of modesty, of privacy, of basically you can do what you want, provided you do it in your own home. It is undoubtedly because of this tolerance, this lack of bloodshed, this outward-looking port grows into the richest, most globally connected city in the world. They don't want to fight. They want to go out and make money. And to understand that, I mean, we need to look at another building. This is the red brick building known as the Oost-Indisch House, founded in 1606 and is headquarters to the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company. That's my terrible Dutch accent, but it is basically the Dutch equivalent of what I was talking about yesterday, the British East India Company, and it precedes the British. If modern capitalism had a birthplace, it is in the Oost-Indisch Huis. The growth of Amsterdam's VOC, let's call it for short, becomes the consolidated center of capitalist entrepreneurship. It significantly benefited from the arrival of those Calvinists from Antwerp because their merchants brought with them all of the knowledge and all of their commercial savvy, as well as their love of risk and also of gambling. Because essentially this whole thing, as I said yesterday, was a huge gambling exercise. In a book by Simon Sharma called The Embarrassment of Riches, he writes, wages were made on every conceivable opportunity, from the outcome of a siege to the sex of an impending baby. They were made on the streets and taverns, at home or in barges. The stakes could be a house full of furniture or a tankard of ale. So they loved a good bet. And in a way, the founding, as I say, of the VOC is the biggest and most lucrative bet in Dutch history. And also, as I mentioned yesterday, at that time, it was the Portuguese who ruled the waves. They had already set up a global trading empire along the trade routes to those lucrative spice islands. But now the Dutch launch an aggressive takeover move, and they move in with their faster, better ships, basically better technology. They go a step further, though, with their business. They don't just bring the goods back to Amsterdam that they find. They develop a whole new system of early globalization, let's put it like that. They sell not just to the Dutch, they sell to other ports more or less under Dutch control, but including, let's say, Indonesian spices to the Arabian Peninsula, Persian carpets to New Amsterdam, which was the land that they then traded with the British and became New York, and they sell Chinese porcelain to India. They persuade the manufacturers across the world to adapt their production to suit local markets, and they reflect the demands of the local consumers. It is a radical idea at the time. Even Japan, who famously banned the Europeans from trading on their shores, makes an exception for the Dutch. And at the center of this massive, growing global network is Amsterdam and the VOC, blazing a path for this new consumerism, let's say, and new capitalism. There are now more commodities available and concentrated in one place, Amsterdam, than ever before in human history. And we're talking about pepper, spices, porcelain, paper, tea, coffee. It is a stupefying scale. French philosopher René Descartes described the whole of Amsterdam as having the curiosity to consume, which was never more stimulated. Descartes spent much of his life in the Netherlands. He's also attributed with another more famous quote, probably inaccurately, which the Dutch are, not surprisingly, quite fond of. God created the world, but it was the Dutch that created the Netherlands. We talked about the chauvinism of the Norwegians. There's no shortage of it in Holland. From this evolves this sense that the dikes, the dams, all this sophisticated shipbuilding and this global fleet that they put together, the Dutch basically managed to conquer nature itself. Do they possess an innate ability to win land and riches from the sea? That's certainly what this quote implies, obviously. They certainly do this by effectively also inventing the modern financial industry through stockholding, some time before the English. I mentioned yesterday about how the East India Company developed stockholding. Well, the Dutch got there first, and it essentially invents this idea of shareholding. Not in individual expeditions, but rather more radically, shares in the VOC itself. And this was a very radical idea, because it allowed, of course, for speculation. Suddenly, share dealing is born. The Amsterdam stock market, the Bourse, is built 6 years later, but the Calvinist aristocracy, not the merchants, consider it a little bit grubby. It's a little bit undignified for them to get involved, so they employ third parties known as brokers to do the grubby work for them. And naturally, of course, there were immediately villains and scandals and crazes and crashes right from the start, including this man, Isaac Lemaire, who becomes the world's first short seller. He bets against the VOC. He then spreads a rumor that the VOC is going under, and he makes some money, but not before the Dutch authorities catch up with him and they invent financial regulation and declare share manipulation illegal. But the most famous, and you may have heard of this, of all of the Dutch financial scandals that emerges from all of this new stock trading is the tulip mania. It is a spectacular speculative bubble that goes horribly wrong. Tulips at the time were not well known in the Netherlands, may be surprised to know, but they were imported at great cost from the Ottoman Empire, and they become a huge craze. They become a status symbol for all those wonderful Dutch gardens. So, of course, investors start to take an interest in this new product, and suddenly speculators weren't just dealing in tulips, but they were dealing in tulip futures and tulip derivatives and credit default swaps. Well, I might have made that last one up, but that's probably something similar. But anyway, the authorities in Amsterdam step in to try and calm this tulip bubble. And what happens when governments intervene to regulate the market? Everybody gets a little bit nervous, the market wobbles, and there is an almighty price crash. And a lot of people lose a lot of money. Despite this, or maybe because of it, Amsterdam is becoming the center of European finance. It is expanding these vast trading networks across the world and reaping the result of all of that wealth and the goods and the commodities that are coming to Amsterdam. From the 17th century, it is boomtown. And normally, of course, in boom towns, everybody gets fabulously rich, but also in boom towns, everyone gets a little crowded. So the old center is encircled by just one canal and the city wall. It is very cramped, and beyond the town, those terps and those muddy marshes and bogs remain. So the authorities have no choice. They have to expand, they need the room, and they then build the iconic Amsterdam that we know today, with its three great ring canals, the Herensgracht, the Keizersgracht, and the Prinsengracht. And they have these fabulous merchants' townhouses along their banks, which also doubled as warehouses for many of those goods coming in through the canals. And it creates, I would say, one of the greatest urban panoramas of Europe. What makes it more extraordinary is the sheer complexity of construction, because all of this, as I say, was built on these marshy bogs. All this infrastructure is unimaginably complex. The canals had to be carved out, of course. The mud had to be dredged and then mixed with sand and gravel into building material. The roads had to be laid down with bricks. And to build the houses, they had to drive 50-foot Scandinavian timber piles into all that peat and sand and clay. And those logs are still there in the foundations of those houses today, preserved in the briny water. This incredible engineering explains why the townhouses were built 5 or 6 stories high, because having gone to all that expense and effort, the buildings had to be tall to justify the cost and make a profit. So you have these wonderful, tall, thin structures. It also explains the birth of exceptional Dutch engineering talent and skill, and that knowledge obviously persists today. So welcome to the Dutch Golden Age. This is an age of scientific inquiry, and it results, as I say, in this beautiful urban landscape or cityscape, and these new temples to capitalism are popping up everywhere. They don't impress some people. It is a painter called Rembrandt who continues to paint these more idyllic scenes of the old world, if you like, before these shiny bling temples to entrepreneurship go up around him. So some people were hanging on to the old ideas. Some Londoners still scoff at what they see as the vulgarity of Canary Wharf. I don't know whether some older Chinese think the same of modern Shanghai, but obviously modern developments have their detractors too. But the man running these new temples to capitalism was a man called Andries de Graaf. He was the city mayor of the time. And at this point, remember, the Netherlands is a nation. It has become a nation, but it's a republic, and it's proudly a republic. De Graaf was the equivalent, I guess, of a senator, if you like, and he was also one of the richest men in Amsterdam. He had a vast art collection, which was displayed in one of the grandest houses, his house, of course, on that Herengracht, the Huis de Graaf, not surprisingly, and it's partly thanks to de Graaf that everywhere you go in Amsterdam, you see this fabulous architecture dedicated to the glory of the Golden Age. In particular, those merchants' warehouses, where they would lift their goods and barrels and containers up into the warehouses. If you want to see real Dutch engineering ambition, you need to go to City Hall on Dam Square. It is an incredible building. It was opened and occupied by Andries de Graaf's brother, Cornelis de Graaf, in 1655. At the time, it was one of the largest buildings in Europe, only eclipsed perhaps by St. Peter's in Rome or the Doge's Palace in Venice. It is a monumental building. And remember, this is all built on marsh. It's supported by 14,000 timber beams. in the spirit of that collaborative Dutch tolerance, let's say, it wasn't built as a palace for the royals. As I say, it was a republic. It was dedicated to civic virtue and incorruptibility. Inside, you'll find murals. That's not a very good photo, but you'll find murals decorated with intricate inlaid maps, of course, celebrating the Golden Age. But the town hall becomes an emblem of the Dutch Republic and of its engineering skill. And, of course, its ability to keep the sea out, because City Hall stands on Dam Square, which is a dam built over the River Amstel. So this whole building is actually built on a dam. And here's the contradictory part that I mentioned at the top of the talk. The tolerance and peace that was going on, all this talk of republic and of civil life, was encouraged and practiced at home, but of course the Dutch were still fighting brutal wars right across the world throughout the 17th century against the English, of course, against the French, against the Portuguese, and notably sending their fleet on an unwelcome raid, probably just over there, down the River Medway, off the Thames, to destroy the naval dockyards. I mentioned in the talk about the English East India Company that Thomas Smythe found the Scourge of Malice in those naval dockyards in Deptford. That's the dockyard that the Dutch then go and raid and destroy. In sweet revenge, they lose their title and their crown to the English slowly over the next few decades. Gradually, Dutch naval power starts to slip, and that marshy little backwater in the New World called New Amsterdam, that I mentioned a couple of times, that becomes New York, is then transferred in a deal to the English East India Company. Slowly, the English start to eclipse Dutch supremacy of the seas, just as the Dutch had done to the Portuguese. Despite all of this, though, Amsterdam remains fabulously rich and fabulously significant as a European city, not just because of entrepreneurship, but because it has become, thanks to its reputation of welcoming the Calvinists, let's say, and other groups, it's become this center for freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And it draws on that legacy of tolerance. Not just through Descartes, who I mentioned, but many other great thinkers, including the Dutch Jewish philosopher Spinoza, whose writing becomes the touch paper of the radical Enlightenment, as was also the English philosophers Hobbes and Locke. They also come to the city to publish these radical ideas, and they inspire some of the thinking that goes into the American and French revolutions and constitutions. But now something very strange happens, because that revolution in France means that the French decide to expand and occupy Holland, and ironically the French revolutionaries, who have got rid of their monarchs, decide to impose one on the Dutch, thanks to our friend Napoleon Bonaparte. He puts his younger brother Louis installed as the king, and he moves in to Dam Square, into the fabulous City Hall, which then becomes not a great symbol of Dutch republicanism, but it becomes a royal palace. And despite all of this, the French invading, installing their king in their Republican City Hall, the Amsterdammers still don't seem to mind much. In fact, they quite like Louis. They call him Louis the Good, and he in turn seems to like the Dutch. So it's all peace and love and understanding, even for the marauding French. By 1813, though, Napoleon is in decline. The French withdraw from the Netherlands, but the Dutch forget all about being a republic, and the City Hall continues as a royal palace. They proclaim their first homegrown king, who was known as the Stadtholder, who's essentially another senator, but they bring him in as their first king, and they title him King Wilhelm I. And the city hall, that Republican wonderful building, becomes the royal palace of the Dutch monarchy, and it still is to this day. None of these shifts, from Catholicism to Protestantism, from republic to monarchy, seem to have caused the Dutch much trouble at all. They just seem to take it in their stride, without the bloody revolutions or the civil unrest that we are seeing elsewhere at the time in Europe, particularly, of course, in France. Tolerance seems to be everywhere. If we look across Dam Square on the other side, we find a building much later in terms of eras, but this is the Birkenhof, otherwise known as the Beehive. It's a famous department store. You can visit it if you choose to, and it is another emblem, if you like, of this extraordinary story of Amsterdam. Its founder was Simon Goldsmith. He was a key figure in the town's Jewish community, and by the 1930s, Jews made up 15% of Amsterdam's population. The roots of the Jewish community can be traced back, obviously, to this similar religious tolerance demonstrated by the city. Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula start to hear of the tolerant attitudes, and they move to Amsterdam during the ruthless Reconquista, the Spanish Inquisition, a couple of centuries earlier. Amsterdam would have seemed like a haven of tolerance by comparison. Gradually, the Jewish community grows more confident and builds what's known as the Portuguese synagogue, which still stands in Amsterdam. It is a remarkable statement of confidence and freedom of expression. The synagogue itself is built on a massive scale, has a wonderful barrel-vaulted ceiling inside, but of course, as we know, the confidence evaporates. By the early 20th century, the Jewish community was more or less scattered across the city. By the time the Nazis invade the Netherlands, and unfortunately, you might think that because they were scattered, they were difficult to find, but the Netherlands administration had very efficiently, long before the Nazis invaded, categorized its different communities and faiths into what they called pillars, or pillarization, as it was known. So when the Nazis declared war on the Netherlands in 1940, the Dutch immediately capitulate, not for any other reason than that they had an army of cycling soldiers and 2 tanks. So they surrender immediately. The Nazis carefully assemble the Dutch files. This pillarization becomes very useful to them, and it becomes almost impossible for the Jews to escape. Hence, Anne Frank hiding in the attic. Of all the countries occupied by the Nazis, the Jews in the Netherlands fare the worst. They had the lowest survival rate. 3 out of 4 died in the camps. Of a population of 80,000, 58,000 were killed. What gives this an extraordinary dimension is that Nazism sat in stark contrast to everything that characterized the centuries of international, liberal, progressive, open-minded tolerance that I've described. And what sets the final seal on the horrors of the war is that in the winter of 1944-45, when the rest of Western Europe, in particular France and Belgium, had already been liberated, Holland remained under Nazi occupation. And that winter was particularly severe. It was known as the Hunger Winter, when Amsterdammers were reduced to eating flower bulbs from their gardens. So if we take all of this into perspective, if we look at this liberal city that we're familiar with today, there's a strong argument perhaps to say But its character was hugely informed by the horrors of what happened in the war, because post-war Amsterdam then becomes the most liberal city in the world. It is the crucible of the 1960s, of all the peace and love that we're familiar with of that decade, and the most obvious example of that liberalism and liberalization is right next to the Oude Kerk that I mentioned, and that is the city's red light district. Probably the most recognizable part of Amsterdam. More famous perhaps to many tourists than Rembrandt or the glorious 17th century architecture. This hyper-liberalism, let's call it, the permissive, tolerant culture that develops was undoubtedly, I would say, turbo-boosted by the trauma that Amsterdam went through in direct reaction to the horrors of Nazism. You could make a direct causal link even further back, perhaps, to the Begenhof and the tolerance between Catholics and the Calvinists, and you could maybe link that tolerance all the way through and after the Second World War to the tolerance of the red light district. This idea that you can do what you like, provided it's in your own home. Clearly, it's a bit of a stretch to say this is going on in their own homes, but technically it's behind someone else's door. This distinctive attitude where life on the margins of what's allowed legally is tolerated and allowed continues to operate. And this applies also to the sex workers in Amsterdam, who are very proud of the fact that they have a union called Red Thread that supports and advocates for their rights. And you see something similar in the radical approach to gay rights as well, which emerges almost after the war. In Amsterdam in 1946, we have the first gay rights movement that emerges 1946, a long time ago. And in 2000, the Netherlands becomes the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. So all of this liberalism, all of this liberal attitude through the 70s onwards, with relatively relaxed immigration rules too, continues with the notorious coffee shops, as they were euphemistically named, in which marijuana, although technically illegal, is tolerated behind closed doors in private establishments. Inevitably, all of this creates a problem, and it's been growing more vivid and more obvious lately, because the perception abroad, not least in Britain, is that Amsterdam is a party town, it's a lawless, hedonistic paradise, and it clearly attracts a massive influx of people on stag do's and hen parties, as we call them in England, intent on behaving not always so greatly. So perhaps, and probably, not helped by comedy sketches in the UK of liberal Dutch cops allowing most everything to occur. And in contrast to that, the Dutch have started an advertising campaign to try and dissuade tourists coming to the city just looking for sex and drugs. So, ironically, for a town originally built on the principles of Calvinist modesty and decorum, even the most liberal city in the world doesn't actually like the results of what it's seeing today, partly because inevitably the coffee shops and the red light district and some of the liberal migration policies have become a front for criminal cartels using Amsterdam as a center for trafficking. The most sensitive expression of this rejection of ultra-liberalism in recent political elections has been the rise of a new nationalist party led by this guy, Geert Wilders, who is today obviously a politician of some power, but also of some great argument and dispute, but it is a rise of a similar dynamic across much of Europe. All of this to say, Amsterdam remains a lively, dynamic, perplexing place. Unlike Venice, it is very definitely not a historical museum, let's say. It's very much a working town still. It's massively influential still in the way that Europe and the world thinks and works. And what makes it incredible is that it is still a very tolerant place, despite the difficulties that it's going through. And that's also what makes it, to some extent, also a political petri dish for the rest of Europe. So how, to come back to that first question that one of you raised when we talked about Norway and the Vikings, how do we square these two countries that we've traveled through, the Netherlands and Norway, which started out warring and pillaging and looting with the tolerant, peaceful countries that we visited at the front and the back of the cruise. In the end, maybe they just became extraordinarily wealthy and extraordinarily tolerant, and maybe in the end they found better things to do than go out pillaging. I'm not pretending to have an answer. I just thought it was a really great question and one that's worth contemplating as we approach the Netherlands. But that, for now anyway, is my story of piracy perhaps, but anyway, the story of sex and drugs and Amsterdam. Thank you. Morning. But thank you anyway for all your wonderful input, and please enjoy Amsterdam however you choose to enjoy it. Thanks again.